So I want to welcome you all to Triangle Free Thought Society's February meeting. A lot of you I know me, but there's a lot of people I don't know. So if this is your first time here, could you just raise your hand real fast? See? Wow, a lot of people. So how many of you here specifically because it's Aaron here? How many of you are voidlings? A couple of voidlings, cool. And I don't think he's going to touch on that really in the presentation, so it'll just be a mystery for the rest of you. So I want to welcome you. My name is Matthew. I'm on the board here, and it is my pleasure to introduce speakers because nobody else likes to be in the front of the room. So just since there are so many new people, just hit on our mission real fast. We're basically here to create community for rational, God's-free living. We have four main pillars: activism, education, community, service. Anytime we have a meeting, it's community, because we're all meeting each other in community building. Today's going to be heavy in education because of who our speaker is. So it's going to be an exciting double whammy for us. In general, we are non-religious people, non-believers, atheists, agnostics, humanists, secularists, whichever word you like to use. And we just come together because we want that community and we want to have someone like us to talk to. And someone who's rational, which is not always the case with our friends and neighbors. Just want to give you a quick look. In February, this is a short section, the past events, because we've only had one event this year. But for those of you who missed it, our dear friend Kim Ellington, long-term member of the group, founding member of the group, came to talk to us in January about Camp 42. If you're familiar with Camp Quest, or campquest.org, campquest.org for podcast listeners, the South Carolina Camp Quest broke off and formed its own thing, Camp 42, and they're now in Florida and one of the other states, Mississippi, maybe, one of the other southern states. So if you have like camper age kids or grandkids or want to be a camp counselor for like week-long camps for about science and philosophy and just general camp stuff, but without prayers before meals, then look up Camp 42 online. They're always looking for volunteers and looking for campers. And my son was a volunteer for them, was a counselor, and it changed his life. It made him a better family member, made him better with his siblings. Really did. It's amazing. So I recommend it highly. Just wait for Alex to come in and sit down. It's cool. So we get some upcoming events, and I'm really excited about these because one of them is an announcement that nobody has heard yet. You guys are going to be the first to know. So in March, we have Bart Campello coming, and he's an atheist, humanist chaplain, and he's a podcaster. He's an author. It's going to be great. He's talking about how we face death and offer comfort. You know, we don't have the "I'll pray for you." We don't have he or she's in a better place. We have the stark realism of death is death. So he's going to help us. How do you get someone through that in a secular mind view? Then in April, we have a big win for us. I think Hemant Mehta, the friendly atheist, is going to be here in April. We're kind of excited about that. So he's, most people probably know who he is. He's a blogger. He's a podcaster. He's a YouTuber. Half the time, if you listen to any atheist podcast, when they talk about a news story, it starts with, "This comes to us by way of the friendly atheist." He interviewed our own Audra Killingsworth, who's Apex Town Council, and when she ran, she did not hide the fact that she was one of us. And so he interviewed her, so that was out there. People Googled her. It came up, secular candidate for town council in Southern Town. And she won. She's on my town council. Yeah. And she says she's not the only one. When the prayers happen, she locks eyes with one or two other people on the council who are not bowing their heads either. They just haven't been as out as her. We're always looking for new special events. So if anybody has a great idea for some kind of a fun activity, like we're talking about doing a family museum day, we do picnics in the summer, but if anyone has idea for volunteer opportunities or just fun opportunities that they would like to spearhead or at least bring up to us, we're always looking for cool stuff on the board. Just grab one of us board people. I'm the only one in the room, but people outside the door are also then. We have happy hours, so we have them. We just missed them. Too late for this month. But we got Raleigh and Durham happy hours. We have fun and game nights. This Friday night's a fun and game night. So if you look on our website or on our Facebook page, you can learn about our fun and games. We have fun and games. Now the important stuff. The reason you're here, our featured presenter. Professor Aaron Rabinowitz. He's a philosopher in residence at Rutgers Honors College. I think the part I love about his stuff is that he's into sentient AI and the risks and rewards of super intelligence, weak AI. It's amazing, but it's not what he's going to talk to us about today. When the pizza comes, if Mark doesn't monopolize all his time talking about the ethics of AI, then feel free to ask him questions about that. He can go on at length. But he's a philosopher, and he's going to talk to us about moral realism. It's going to be great. Some of the people here I know are here for the same reason that I asked Aaron here, because he's also a podcaster and a satirist, big on satire, and a mentat. And tell who my people are. So he has two podcasts that I listen to religiously, excuse the term, Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. Embrace the Void was born of Trump being elected and him realizing we were in the worst possible alternate timeline. And it's looking at philosophy through kind of a horror, Lovecraftian kind of viewpoint. And those of us who listen are his little voidlings. We do whatever he says. And also, in the way I first became aware of Aaron, he co-hosts a podcast called Philosophers in Space, where they watch awesome science fiction movies and horrible science fiction movies, and sometimes episodes of science fiction shows, sometimes short stories, and they discuss the philosophies through that. Aaron tells us why they're awesome movies, and his co-host Thomas, who has no feet, tell us why they're terrible. And with that, we'll leave you with Aaron Rubin.
Y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Good? All right, great. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me. Thank you, all of y'all, for having me into the safe part of North Carolina. I really appreciate that. As a native Virginian, I feel it, your pain, and I understand. And so I'm here with you to help. So how many of y'all, let's just get started here, right? How many of y'all have ever engaged with a question like this before, been confronted with a problem of this sort, right? This particular one is from Glorious PragerU's arguments about this, but you'll also probably see a lot of presuppositionalists these days making this kind of argument. The reason being they've been forced, I think, to abandon the idea that atheists can't act morally, psychologically speaking, right? And they've moved to a more philosophical position, which they call the moral argument for God, which says that without a supreme being of some sort, there can be no objective morality. And so my goal tonight is going to be to try to help y'all understand why I, a lifelong atheist, believe fairly strongly, as strongly as a philosopher can believe anything, that moral realism is true, that there are objective moral truths out there in the world, that they are knowable by us, and that we can, that we can act based on them, that we can learn about them, all these important things that we want from morality. Now, how we're going to get there, I want to start with the story. This is one of my favorite stories from the history of philosophy. How many of y'all are familiar with the Euthyphro? Right, great. So for those who aren't, right, the Euthyphro is one of probably my favorite of the Socratic dialogues. Our hero Socrates, as you might know, spent all of his life arguing with other philosophers in Athens to the point in which they had him killed, right? So this story, the Euthyphro, takes place on the steps of the courthouse on the day, in theory, supposedly, right, the story goes, when Socrates was on his way to be tried for blasphemy and corruption of the youth and speaking ill words against the gods, the fun stuff. As he's going there, right, he comes across this young, up-and-coming sophist named Euthyphro, who's well known around the city for being someone who claims to know all about piety and the nature of God and God's will. So much so that Euthyphro feels confident that he's on his way to prosecute his own father for murder of a slave, which he believes is the right thing to do, and that is what the gods would want. And so, naturally, Socrates, with no concern for the fact that he has to go, get tried, right, immediately starts up a dialogue with this individual on what is the nature of piety, right? And it's a short, wonderful dialogue. I recommend everyone give it a read. The most important part of it is this really, really brilliant question that Socrates gets to over the course of their incomplete attempts to try to define piety. They fail, as they usually do. But this question, I think, is incredibly insightful. So insightful that Euthyphro didn't understand the question at the time, I think. And we've since come to see the value of this question, right? So Socrates asks Euthyphro, right? Is that which is holy loved by the gods because it is holy? Or is it holy because it is loved by the gods, right? Is it good because the gods love it, or do they love it because it is good, is the way that this question is going to go. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds about what Euthyphro answers. Euthyphro takes what is effectively the realist position, but I think because he doesn't really understand the question. But this question is of immense importance when understanding not just the nature of morality in relation to whether God exists, but understanding the nature of morality even when God doesn't exist. I really think that this question, properly understood, cleaves the world of metaethics at the joint, as it were, right? It really separates the world into the most important kinds of theories that we can talk about here. So, as with any good dilemma, right, we can understand the Euthyphro dilemma like a charging bull, right? You've got two really angry horns coming at you, and they both have problems, right? They're both quite pointy, right? And then, as is often the case, right, there are various kinds of middle paths that people will try to take to avoid those horns of that dilemma. I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight. Feel free to ask me if you want about quasi-realism and why I think it collapses into one of the other sides of the dilemma. I don't really think there's a third option, though I will talk a little bit about why the Christians think they've solved this problem with a third option. Right, so reframing the question to make it a little more useful for us, right? We can basically reframe it to say, are things moral because God says so, or does God say they are moral because they are moral, right? The first part, the first lemma there, right, the first half of the dilemma, is what we have conventionally come to understand as divine command theory, right? The idea that God is the source of moral truth. God determines what is and isn't moral. Now, modern presuppositionalists will say this is a straw man version of divine command theory, and that's their attempt to solve the problem. What they'll say is this dilemma doesn't affect the Christian God because Christian God is good by nature. It is the nature of God that determines what is and isn't good. So it's not that God's will decides what is or isn't good, and it's not that there's something above God that determines what is or isn't good. It's that good and God are one and the same thing. Now, I think that's just really a refusal to address the question seriously. I just think so the atheist response is typically, well, you've just pushed the problem back one step. Right? We can reasonably ask, what determines the essential features of God's nature? Is God's nature to love, compassion for others versus hatred towards others? If that's an essential fact, what makes it an essential fact? Is it, if it's something above and beyond God? Yeah. Or do you want to?
You said that many people say that good and God are the same thing, and my usual retort is that, well, is good capable of creating evil or creating bad, creating suffering? That's where I would go there.
Right.
Are we talking a different good equals God argument? So
usually these individuals will also say that evil is not a real thing. It's an absence of God in some kind of way, and that's their way of explaining that evil, right? I don't want to get too far into the problem of evil in this context. The point here is what they'll say is God's nature is necessarily equal to the objective moral truth. I, again, think that is a refusal to answer the question. I think it's perfectly reasonably phrased to ask, what made it so that this was God's nature and not some other thing? And I think they ultimately have to say that something above and beyond God is what determines God's will. But our goal here is not to argue with the theist. My goal here is to give you, as secularists, put you a little more at ease with the idea that moral truths can still be real even if God doesn't exist. Because I think that there are understandable anxieties, especially among the secular community, about these kinds of claims, right? Now, I'm going to just put a pin in this right here and say the major problem is most people understand it with divine command theory. One of the major problems is that it's arbitrary, right? If God could really will anything to be good, it doesn't matter what he chose or didn't choose. There was no reason for him to choose one thing over another, right? That's what it would mean if it was truly up to him. This is going to be a problem in a second, right? So I want to rephrase this and take God out of the perspective for a second, right? We'll leave God alone. the question can also be applied just to us, right? Are things moral because we say they are moral, or do we say they are moral because they are moral? Now, I'm curious, just intuitively right now, how many of you would identify with the first half of this? Things are moral because we say they are moral. Few? Yeah. I think my experience has generally been that that is the more sort of common, intuitively plausible perspective, especially amongst secular atheists. How many of you would say it's the second half? Okay, great. So we got a couple of potential moral realists already in the group. So I want to talk first about why subjectivism is, I think, very tempting to a lot of people. Why it makes sense that we want to say morality is only what we say it is, right? So subjectivism, just to define our terms, right? Things are immoral because we say they are moral or immoral, right? It's all really up to us. We're building this as we go, right? The first reason I think this is very plausible for a lot of folks who've especially walked away from religion is that it gels very well with a materialist version of the world, right? Out there in the world, there are these physical, material things, right? And then in here, there's consciousness. And consciousness can choose to make up rules for itself about what it ought to do or ought not to do, but there's no oughts out there in the fabric of the universe, right? I think that feels very plausible to a lot of people, especially when you add in evolution, right? We have this perfectly reasonable account for why morality and moral beliefs would evolve without them being true in any kind of real sense. They're useful. It's adaptive for us to come together and agree not to kill each other. Right? That doesn't need to be a recognition of some fact out there in the world, right? So these are the reasons that I think it's understandable that a lot of folks who walk away from religion also walk away from objective morality. They can totally make sense of their universe without it, most of them think, right? And the other reason is that for a lot of people, objective morality is very strongly connected to a kind of moral tyranny. Right? Many people have spent their lives listening to people talk about the objective truths out there in the world as a way to hammer people down into being what they want them to be, right? So this kind of historic religious cruelty, right, has so often been justified by moral realism. And it's entirely true. Like, there's no denying that. Moral realism can be used in despicable ways because it is a very effective way of talking about things, I think. We want to talk in objective kinds of ways, as I'll argue here in a second, right? But we have to earn that. So, what are the problems with subjectivism, right? So, the main problem with subjectivism is the same problem with divine command theory. It suffers from a kind of arbitrariness, right? If it's really true that there's no fact of the matter about what we ought to do or ought not to do, what you end up deciding about what you ought to do could have just as well been decided by a roll of the dice, right? If there's really no reasons for why you ought to do one thing over another, you're essentially submitting to a coin flip. So one major problem, I think, with subjective is that it doesn't accurately describe how we actually perceive our beliefs and our judgments, especially about ought claims. When I say, or when you say, you ought not to do this thing, right? You ought not to enforce religion on young children or something. I don't think you mean, I personally would prefer it if you didn't, or I think it's wrong for me not to. You mean, I think it's wrong for you not to, in a robust and objective kind of way. Also, right, if the subjectivists are right, moral debate kind of seems to go out the window, right? If there's really no fact of the matter, if it's really just personal preference, right? You prefer torture and I prefer not torture. There's no debate to be had about which one is actually objectively better or worse. It's just, it's ice cream flavors, right? So these are, I think, why we can, I think, fairly quickly accept that subjectivism is not the kind of morality we actually want. It's tempting to talk in those terms, but it doesn't get us the kind of robust way of talking about morality that we're really looking for. Now, that doesn't mean that it's false. It might be the case that there is no moral truth in the world, and the best we can do is make do with subjective moral claims. I don't think that's the case, right? But I still have to prove that. One other thing I'll point out is that many individuals thinking contrary to me that moral realism is false, right, will then go on to try to construct some kind of objective system of ethics out of sort of their understanding of things. This is things like social contract doctrine, right? We come together, like I said, we create a system because it's functional, and we act as if it's objective, we talk as if it's objective, even if we know deep down ultimately it's based on our own personal desires and preferences, right? I personally don't think this works. I think that to get a robust social contract, you have to make certain objective moral assumptions. I think people sort of, for example, misunderstand that this wasn't really what Rawls was intending, right? And that like a lot of constructivists I don't think can really get you there. But I'm not necessarily going to argue that too far at this point, because I do want to sort of give a positive account for moral realism. So again, everything I say here is up for lengthy debate, right? None of this is taken for granted. These are just my own personal perspectives on all of these really challenging problems. So if the subjectivism horn is no good, let's assume it's not for a moment, right? What can we say about the realism horn? So I'm going to define moral realism here a little differently than just giving you the second half of the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Instead of just saying it's good, we think it's good because it actually is good, because that can, I think, confuse people a little bit. It's actually good part, what does that mean, right? We'll talk about that weirdness in a second, but I want to define this in more technical, philosophical terms, because I think it'll make clear why this view should actually be treated as fairly uncontroversial, right? So moral realism is the view, in my opinion, this comes from Russ Schaefer Landau. Some moral statements are true independent of our beliefs regarding those statements, right? This feature is called belief independence or stance independence, right? So if I have an objective moral claim that says it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering, right? When I say that is objectively true, what I mean is no amount of anyone believing otherwise would change the moral nature of those kinds of actions, would alter that moral truth at all. And this, I believe, is the kind of reality that we actually care about. Me and my friend Philip K. Dick, right? We both define reality this way. Reality is that thing that won't go away, no matter how much I will it to, right? And that's what we mean here by moral truths. Moral truths persist beyond your desperately wishing them to go away. They are, in this sense, relevantly similar to things like the speed of light or other basic physical laws. I say relevantly similar because there are ways in which they are different, very important ways, but at least in the sense that no amount of me willing the speed of light to change is going to change it. No amount of me believing it's different will make it different. The same, I think, is true for certain moral claims. Maybe not all moral claims, but at least some moral claims. Now, one way in which they're relevantly different, this will come up with the objection concerns, right? Far as I know, they can't be proven in the same way. We cannot prove moral truths the same way that we can prove physical claims about gravity or the nature of light, right? So we're going to have an important separate question about how do we learn moral truths? How can we know the moral truths? But first, let me make a case for why you should all come along with me and believe that this is the right account of morality. So, like all good philosophy, they don't let me touch real science, so I'm only allowed to do thought experiments, okay? So, imagine a world, right, where we all come together and we all decide that torturing puppies for fun is really moral, right? We all hold a vote, right? Super cute, right? We all get together and we vote and we say, you know what, this is moral. We're all going to accept this, right? How many of you would think that it would make it moral if we all voted that way? No one wants to bite that bullet. Now,
on what criteria, though? I mean, because you have to explain in what way.
On any criteria. Do you think there's any criteria that could be presented that would justify that vote in an objective kind of way?
No, I'm just going to fair sheet.
No, you're right. That's fair, right? And I want to make sure you understand, I'm not being unfair here. This is not a straw man. This is a genuine, what we would call a reductio ad absurdum, which means taking a view to its absurd logical conclusions. And I will promise you, I have had philosophers, anti-realists, bite this bullet and tell me, if we had that vote, it would make puppy torture moral. I promise you that is the bullet that many of them are willing to bite. Yeah.
I wonder if you're talking about morality just for humans and what you've been discussing so far, because I think of a question like, is it moral for the lion to kill the gazelle? You're just talking about human behavior?
Yeah, that's a good sort of complicated sort of question about how far does this go, right? For the moment, I'm just talking about, see, here's what I would say, right? Morality applies regarding the treatment of all conscious beings and maybe some non-conscious beings, right? I'm still in the process of thinking about how I think ought claims do or do not apply to non-rational, non-human entities. But I would say, for example, our morality is not going to be, I think, fundamentally different than the morality of aliens across the other side of the galaxy, assuming that they are sufficiently like us in certain kinds of ways. Conscious beings, rational beings, social beings, certain key features. And even if they don't have those features, I still believe there will be objective moral truths about how one ought to treat those entities, even though they may be very different than the objective moral truths about how to treat humans. It's a good question, though. If you have any more further thoughts about that, I can get to those kind of things at the end. The important thing I want to point to here, sorry, something else I'll just clarify in case anyone was wondering about ethics versus morality. I use those two terms interchangeably, as for the most part, modern ethicists do. I don't make a specific distinction between them. I don't think there's a strong reason to maintain a distinction between them. So I want to point out here, right, more than just saying this is a reductio ad absurdum, though I think it is, right? One man's absurdity is another person's bullet they're willing to bite. I want to explain a little further why I think this thought experiment really matters, is because I think not only do we think that wouldn't change the morality of torturing puppies at all, it's not even related to the thing that makes torturing puppies actually immoral, right? When you think about what it is that makes it wrong to torture another conscious being, it's because they suffer in this particular case, right? It's because they experience a kind of negative evaluative state that is bad, right? Hang on one sec. And that inflicting on that on them is objectively wrong. So it has nothing to do at all with what anyone believes about the situation that drives this moral decision. Yeah.
I think I'm going to go back and invite people and say yes, it would be.
That's fine.
Mostly just to argue the point, but we have decided that chicken torture is okay. We've decided pig torture is okay. We've decided cow torture is okay. So there are cultures where they raise puppies for meat.
Sure.
And I would imagine treated about as well as the food that I think most of us in this room have eaten today.
Yeah, right. This is called the argument from disagreement, right? There is disagreement about moral truths, right? But that being said, there are cultures that practice slavery, right? How many folks in here think it's objectively wrong to keep another person as property? It's pretty hard to bite that bullet, I think, right? It's pretty hard to bite the bullet and say there was nothing wrong about what the Nazis did because it was right for them, right? They believed it was right for them very strongly, right? So if you're willing to bite that subjectivism bullet, it leads to some pretty severe problems, I think. Yeah. Okay. That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I commonly recommend to skeptics as a meditative practice to go into a room and close the door and repeat to yourself, the Nazis were just wrong. They were just, I mean, like, I understand the deep-seated discomfort with moralizing, right? I have a lot of people, I mean, like, I'm Chidi from The Good Place, and everyone hates me because I say what you're doing is actually wrong. It's not just that we think it's kind of wrong, it's that it really is wrong. And I understand that there can be a lot of issues, and I'll talk to them about the tyranny thing a little bit because I get that. I don't think that that's a good reason, though, for us to abandon these kind of concerns.
One thing is, there's the wrong of being factually wrong, which the Nazis were. I mean, they exaggerated all these different things that
Sure.
compulsed them. So that has, as far as something that to define something that's moral, you would have to look at the factual information relative to.
True, but I think they would have been wrong even if they were right on the facts, in a sense,
Yeah,
right?
well,
They're wrong on the moral facts.
But I think they probably wouldn't have done that if they were right on the facts.
Possibly, right? If they'd been better on the facts, they might have been better on the other side
They
too.
would have had to have an open society to discuss it and everything.
It's possible. So what do I mean by these foundational objective ethical truths? I want to give you a few examples, right? I'm what's called a pluralist. I think that there are multiple, irreducible, foundational objective ethical truths, which is to say, each of these truths are true and in tension with each other. And in reality, you're going to be spending most of your life working through situations where these truths are in tension, and you have to figure out how to balance them. So, for example, right, virtue theory, a personal favorite of mine, right, almost every one of the valuable normative theories, the kinds of things like utilitarianism and deontology, basic theories about what you ought to do and ought not to do, are largely centered around intuitions, ethical intuitions that I think are objectively true. So, for example, all things being roughly equal, one ought to promote the flourishing of beings, right? So if there is a being that can flourish, right, and you can always unpack all of this in more detail. What does flourishing actually mean? Though I think most of you in this room probably understand what I mean by flourishing. You know when you're not flourishing versus when you are, right? And the all things being equal means, again, this is not an all things considered claim, right? You don't maximize flourishing at the cost of everything else all the time. It's that at least all things being equal, this is something of objective moral concern, right? So another one would be like the hedonistic view. All things being roughly equal, one ought to promote pleasurable mental states and prevent painful mental states, right? This gets built into utilitarianism, into lots of people's views about consequentialism. And I think, again, right, once you understand the nature of pain and pleasure, right, as phenomenal mental states that have positive and negative value built into them intrinsically. There's no conversation to be had about what pleasure is without talking about the positive valence of that experience. Same thing opposite with pain, right? These are fundamentally evaluative states, and in that way they can produce a fundamental objective ethical claim that you ought to avoid one of these states and you ought to promote the other. Again, all things being equal, right? These two, you can already see, can come into tension, right? Building virtues, flourishing, involves putting yourself in situations where sometimes you feel less pleasure and more pain, just like going to the gym, right? We all understand, at least analytically, right, the value of going to the gym, right? It's, in theory, something that we want to do, even though it hurts when we do it, because we see that as justified for the overall flourishing of the organism, right, the individual. And then finally, right, and it's not finally, right, there's many more than this, I think, right, but at least these ones are worth talking about and understanding broadly, right? All things being roughly equal, one ought to treat sentient entities as ends in themselves and not as mere means to an end, by respecting their autonomous decision-making. So wherever possible, right, you should promote the ability of individuals to choose their own ends for themselves, to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in a sense, right? These are fundamentally good things. They will come into tension again, right? Sometimes, right, in order to prevent a bunch of pain, you have to restrict someone's autonomy. That does happen, right? But without some justification, you should not enslave someone, right? Even if it might, for example, produce more pleasure, some would argue, right? So how we balance these fundamental ethical truths is the lifelong project of practical wisdom, right? This is what you have to build your moral organ up to be able to do, to think about all these complex trade-offs and figure out what you think the right action might be in any given situation. So I'm going to look at a couple of, there are many, many objections to moral realism. I'm going to look at the two that I think are going to be most pressing in the minds of secular atheists. And then I'll list a bunch of other ones that y'all can feel free to dive on for the questions afterwards, right? But I'm going to start with what's called the argument from queerness. This is queerness in the classic sense of very weird. This is an argument that originates with a guy named Mackey, a famous error theorist, who says there are no objective moral truths out there in the world. Right? What he says is, again, going back to our materialist worldview, right? In a world of is claims, it would be very strange to discover that there were just some ought things just out there in the world, independent of humans having put them there. Right? They seem kind of strange. And they're strange because, right, they're not just statements about what is. Those are easy to understand. They're statements about what ought to be, or what one ought to do, which are, in a sense, it feels like to a lot of people, not actually claims about reality, but claims about the way you think reality should be. Though in my opinion, they are, in a sense, both, right? They are claims about the way reality is and the way that it should be. But from Mackey's perspective, this was just too weird, right? He said, for this view, this moral realist view to be true, things out there in the world would have to have these weird, non-natural features, like to-be-doneness or to-be-avoidedness built into them, right? Pain would be intrinsically to be avoided or something. And he thinks that's just too weird to accept on a modern scientific worldview, okay? This is sort of his version of a reductio ad absurdum against moral realism, right? Like I said, one person's absurdity is another person's bullet they're willing to bite. And for me personally, right, this is a bullet that I'm willing to bite. The universe, to me, as far as I can tell, is full of queer entities. So much the better for the universe, right? We can all agree. Right? For example, consciousness, right? Consciousness is weird. It is so weird that science is still struggling to even chip away at fundamentally understanding the hard problem of consciousness. And I think the weirdness of ethics is fundamentally tied up with the weirdness of consciousness. I'm not willing to go so far at this point to say that a universe with no conscious entities wouldn't have any moral claims in it. I think that's a plausible claim, but there's some interesting questions about whether entities can have interests without actually being conscious. It's a sort of sci-fi problem that I'm happy to muse about, but I'm setting aside for now, right? For our purposes, in a universe with conscious entities, I think objective moral claims are just statements about how you ought to treat those entities. And since those entities are kind of weird, right, it follows that those claims are also going to have some weirdness to them. But for those who are still concerned, right, you might be thinking, doesn't this violate the is-ought divide? Right? This is a very famous Humean problem. You can't derive an ought claim from an is claim. Some of you might be feeling like I've been trying to do that over the course of this by saying, pain exists and therefore we ought not to cause pain, right? What I'm actually arguing is slightly different. Hume's right? If you go from just is premises to ought premises in an argument, you've done something wrong, right? What I'm claiming is a good moral argument involves both is claims and objective ought claims, and that those objective ought claims are, in a sense, as foundational as the is claims. And then, by combining those objective ought claims, like the ones I just showed you, with is claims, like what causes pain versus what doesn't, you can derive a bunch more what I would consider still objective claims about how you ought to act in the world. So that's how I think that Hume, you can read Hume lots of different ways. I think one plausible reading of Hume is that he believes something fairly similar. Hume says pleasure is essential for morality, but a good person is someone whose pleasure is connected to the things that one ought to find pleasurable. He takes a sort of Aristotelian approach and says there are, I think, some things that should be inducing of pleasure rather than not. And in that sense, he builds objectivity, evaluative objectivity into his view. Now again, there are humans who will debate me on that, but that's my reading. And I love Hume very dearly. So where does objective morality come from then, right? This is sort of a follow-up question to this problem. As we've seen, right, God can't supply objective morality, even if she exists, right? She's not going to be able to help us out here. The best that God can do is be a perfect indicator towards the objective moral truth, right? Be a perfect perceiver of that moral truth that is even above God. And as we all know right now, society, right, can't merely discover it all by itself, it seems like. It can't construct it all by itself, is what I would say. It can merely discover it or fail to do so, right? Emphasis on the fail to do so a lot of the time. So what I think the optimal answer here is something very similar to the response that you would give when someone asks, who wrote the speed of light? Right? That's a common argument amongst presuppositionalists, similar to the argument from fine-tuning. You get certain arguments that will say things like, if there are laws in the universe, like physical laws, there must be a lawgiver that set those laws in place. And we all, I think, now can reasonably say, no, that's just a misunderstanding of the nature of those laws. It's a category error, as we would say, right? Human laws might have to be written that way, but natural laws aren't like laws chiseled onto a slate or something. Natural laws are just accurate descriptions of the way the world is. They're not out there. They're not, they're ghosts, as Pirsig would say. They're not real things. They're just a way of describing the world that is more accurate, is more true, in a sense. And I think the same is true for moral claims. Objective moral claims are also, in a sense, right, descriptions of the way the world is and the way that the world should be. And so they don't need to have a lawgiver. We don't need a moral lawgiver for morality to be part of the nature of the universe, right? It's just a misconception, I think, even amongst the materialists, that there can only be is claims at the foundations of the universe. Okay, so the other major objection that I'm concerned with, and then I'll open this up, right? How do we gain moral knowledge? So a lot of you, I think, might be concerned, right? Well, let's concede for the moment that objective moral truths exist. How do we, poor monkeys, ever gain any knowledge about them, right? And this is a problem, like I said before, because you can't derive objective moral truths from pure empirical observation the way you can physical laws. I don't think, as far as I can tell. Right? If somebody comes along and they build a machine that can measure morality, that would be great for me. I'd really appreciate that. I don't think it's ever going to happen. Right? So how do we get access to these moral truths? And the answer, I think, is it begins with evolution and culture. Right? Now we have to be very, very careful here. Right? I did my whole master's thesis on the evolutionary attack against moral realism and how people will argue that all that stuff I said before about all of this being practical makes it so that it's unnecessary to claim that it's true, and that you're unlikely to be able to have reliably picked up the truth because it would have gotten mixed up with what was adaptive, right? And then evolution leads to culture. Culture reinforces the imperfect moral truth, right? I'm not going to say here, it would be crazy to say our morality is just what evolution put in us, because evolution gave us a very mixed bag of moral intuitions, right? Some of them are quite good. Fairness and empathy and a sense of justice. These are, I think, very useful tools for getting to the moral truth. But it also gave us a bunch of junk that we need to get rid of that was adaptive at some point, because these things did originally evolve purely because they were adaptive. But, as you will say, right, they can go beyond that, right? So we start with evolution and culture, but we mix in reason and empathy, and we are able to weed the garden of our ethical beliefs, just like we weed the garden of our empirical beliefs. The famous phrase is, right, evolution or morality, right, kicks down the ladder by which it has climbed. It starts with evolution, but it goes beyond that, right? So we have to derive things, and we can use these tools that evolution has given us, right? When I have empathy, it allows me to be vividly aware of the suffering of others, which allows me to realize that their suffering is as morally important as my suffering, especially when I apply reason and say, like things should be treated like ways, your suffering is like my suffering, so if I want to be a rational individual, I should treat them in the same way. This is the way that I think we bootstrap ourselves up into objective moral truth in a very similar way to how we start out with a bunch of really bad mixed views empirically and then get better through reason and observation and more reason and debate, right? Because some observation is valuable for ethics, right? Once we do agree something like you ought to avoid pain, you can go out in the world and study and find what things reduce pain, what things cause more pain. Yeah, go ahead. Well, so in the sense that, like, if we just stopped with cultural relativism, then yes, it would be subjective. But again, I'm just talking about the things that give us our starting ideas. We have to move beyond those starting ideas to something objective. And I think it is robustly objective because we can say certain cultures are wrong about certain things, right? Not everyone feels comfortable saying that, but I think in the modern age we have to be willing to, right, go on and accept that kind of claim. So again, right, in the sense of each of us individually, our perception of this is going to be trapped in a kind of subjectivity, just like your perception of the external world is trapped, limited by a kind of your first-person perspective. But I think by coming together, we can build from that, but not in such a way where we construct the moral truths, but in fact we discover them, right? We unearth them together as a team. Now, what does this mean for the reliability of our knowledge? And the answer is, look, it means that it's not going to be perfect, and that we're going to keep learning, and that things that we think are true now morally are probably going to have to be revised further. We've seen just in the past 30 years, but especially in the past 200 years, massive cultural shifts and upheaval and change to our ethical understanding. And I think most of us would agree that's been moving towards a kind of objective better, like an objective moral improvement in a sense. Sometimes there's backsliding, right? But for the most part, right, we've made things better for people, and that is good. That is right. That is what you ought to do. Okay, so I'm going to just lay out a variety of other potential further concerns just briefly, and if there's something there that's appealing to you, feel free to raise it and I will address it further, right? So, things you might be concerned with. How do you really prove one thing is objectively more moral than another? Couldn't this quickly turn into tyranny? Short answer, could, yes, definitely. Something to be concerned about, definitely. Right? What if someone just doesn't care about being moral? That's reasonable concern people have, right? Does moral realism provide any way to convince them otherwise? Does their lack of interest prove that morality is actually subjective in some kind of way? These are common concerns, right? Or just any sort of fill in the blank of what about some complex ethical problem, right? I want to really make clear here, right? Moral realism is just a starting point. It's not the end of the conversation. It's really the beginning of the conversation. There is a world of really complex ethical problems that still have to be resolved. We're just now accepting that there is a right answer to some of them, right? That it's worth having these kinds of debates. Of course, how do we know this isn't wishful thinking, right? You might be concerned that, again, we really want there to be objective ethical truths, but how do we really know that there actually are? So those are all things that I think are worth sort of addressing further, as well as any other questions that you all have. So I'm going to leave with a few wrap-up thoughts here, right? Again, moral realism, I think, makes much more sense on the atheist view than on the theistic view, unless they're willing to accept a God that is sub the moral law, right? Is dependent on the moral law, is not the source of the moral law. That theism, I think, has fundamental problems with the euthyphro that it's not going to overcome. Also, moral realism should be a pluralistic worldview. There is not one objective moral truth, one objective moral way to live for all human beings. There are different ways to weight those foundational moral truths that I talked about, and depending on how you weight them differently, you are going to value certain things more than others, certain virtues more than others, certain choices in your lives more than others, right? And within a certain range, I think we can say that's great, right? That's the liberal pluralist society that we all want to live in, everyone living their own different kind of weird moral lives. And then outside of those range of moral lives, right, there are a bunch of lives that aren't moral, objectively so. They're not okay, and if someone's doing them, they should be stopped, right? That's how I think the world really looks. And then finally, right, morality, again, remains immensely complex, as it should. That's a selling point on this view, right? Anyone who comes along and says one of the deepest problems of ethics can be easily solved, and in turn everything else can be easily solved, is probably selling you a religion. And I'm only selling you a cult, which is way better. So I'll leave you with this as well, right? If you're interested in, if you're the kind of person who likes to read philosophy, right? This is my recommended text for moral realism. It's dense. It's a little challenging, but it is a great read, right? It blew me away when I first read it, and it's what convinced me more and more of this view as I've come along. So I'm going to leave it there, and if you'll have any more questions, feel free.
Who's the writer?
Rush Schaefer Landau, who's I think still at Milwaukee, University of Milwaukee. Mm-hmm.
So I have a thought. I haven't really quite developed it into a question yet, but I feel like a common thread that would solve a lot of problems and create some other issues is having a common goal. Like, I consider myself apparently a moral realist. I didn't really realize it was the title for it, but like, depending on your goal, there's almost always an objective answer as far as the correct moral path in reference to you were asked about cultural. If culture decides that something is appropriate. And like I said, I don't know how to develop it into a question, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because for one culture in the Middle East, a certain practice might be okay, and then the rest of the world has a different goal of better equality, which would deem that unacceptable. And I'm
Right.
curious.
So this is sort of that question of like, how do you really know the difference between situations where two people disagree and one of them is objectively morally wrong, and two situations where people disagree and it's okay to agree to disagree, I think, right? And I think it goes back to those foundational truths, and there are certain trade-offs between those truths that are unacceptable. So, I think we as a culture accept, for example, that in a religiously free society, we are going to allow chauvinistic and misogynistic religions to persist, religions that allow for and reinforce inequality between the sexes. And there we've made a decision to value autonomy and personal choice more than maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, I think, in those kind of places. Or you could argue that trying to pull those places apart and burn them down would cause more suffering, and so it's unavoidable that there will be some amount of this kind of suffering in the world. And it's often, practically speaking, a very hard choice for where you draw the line about where is too far, right? Is female circumcision too far, right? Is that where you step in with a society? Is child brides too far? And it's hard. I don't want to say that merely because I've offered you up some metaphysical ethical terminology that I can necessarily give you a formula that will allow you to decide one way or the other when it's time to use force. I think we all have to wrestle with those decisions over the course of our lives, and it can be a complicated cost-benefit analysis. But other times we can feel very comfortable in saying, no, I'm not going to do that thing that you're asking me to do that I think is wrong. I don't care what the consequences are, I won't do it. Now, as to your question about differing goals, I think that's another important point here, right? Our ethics will overlap more the more that we share certain ends, right? So if our ends do widely diverge, right? If I'm Conan and I believe that a good life is to crush my enemies and see them driven before me, right? And hear the lamentations of their significant others, right? I will have a very different view about what the objective ethical truths are in that kind of situation. And I think that's a point at which there's no solution, right? You can try to point Conan to the suffering that he is causing and say, see, look at this suffering, you should care about this. You can try to reinstill empathy in him. But for example, I think if you have a thoroughgoing sociopath who has zero empathy, you're just not going to make any progress, except from a purely self-interested perspective, getting them to buy into any of this stuff. And that's why, sometimes conversation turns to force, and it has to, right? And I think the point of one reason to believe moral realism, and this runs the risk of tyranny, is to be able to say, I have a good objective reason for using force, right? This isn't just rule by the boot, right? I have a just cause here that I am acting based on. Yeah.
So, for the fact that it's just a start, and there will be pockets of relative moralism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still sticking with my subjective stance. You haven't convinced me of objectivity, because in objectivity there can be no disagreement.
Really?
If something is objectively moral, it is something that can be seen from anywhere, from any perspective.
Let me ask you a question.
Okay.
Do you believe it's an objective fact that the Earth is a spheroid?
It's an evidentiary fact.
It's objectively true that it's not flat, right?
It is an evidentiary fact that the Earth is an oblate spheroid.
And yet there's a lot of disagreement about this, isn't there?
No, there's pockets of.
But if it was an objective truth, as you said, right, everyone would be able to would believe it.
No, that's
No?
why I'm not saying it's objective. I'm saying it's evidentiary.
So do you believe that there are any objective truths in the world?
Only mathematical and physics constants.
But the physicists disagree, and so do the mathematicians.
Well, there's some change of new evidence.
Okay, right. So here's what I would say, right?
The speed of light is constant in a vacuum.
Right. So here's what I would say, right? We get confused and we think when there is disagreement, that must mean in this particular venue, right, there is no truth of the matter. But we don't make that we don't include that at all when there's disagreement in the scientific realms or in other kinds of argument. And I don't think there's any reason to claim one way versus the other.
Science above philosophy.
See, without us, there's no science.
Yeah.
It all starts with us, buddy.
Started.
Science is just a tool in a toolbox of gaining knowledge. No, this is just truth, right? Science is a couple of tools, right? It's a couple of different logical tools that philosophers built and that philosophers continue to maintain through the philosophy of science, right? Which is a pretty important subject, I think we can agree.
Naturalism is this. I will agree that the philosophical naturalism was the start to the scientific method.
And I don't think that science is done with us. I don't think that it can walk away from a variety of very complicated philosophical problems and get into its machine and figure out the objective facts of everything, right? It's
right.
The reality is way more complicated than that.
But I guess my contention is that I raised my hand when I said that moralism is subjective.
Mm-hmm.
If we both agree to it, it's still subjective, but we share the same perspective, the same stance,
mm-hmm.
but it's still subjective. And I haven't been swayed to say that moralism is an objective thing.
I think I agree with both of you guys. It's subjective. Well, it's subjective.
He's a speaker.
No, go ahead.
I think because I kind of like I couldn't decide which side I agreed with because coming out of religion, yeah, I think there's a lot of morality that's there that I would argue differently. So I think it starts as subjective until there is evidential evidence to make it less subjective and more objective.
I would say our access to it is subjective.
Yeah.
But it is an objective truth. Just like our access to scientific truth is ultimately subjective. I can only see it through my own eyes, right? I can only understand it from my own subjective perspective. And I can get together and agree with other people and look at the way that science works, right? A bunch of subjective, flawed first-person perspectives come together and test each other enough to the point where it seems like they've found something that is true for all of them, right? And I think that's the way that we can come together and discover moral truths, but I think it's correct to say that they are true even when we don't discover them. Even if we failed over the course of all of human history to discover that slavery was wrong, it would still have been wrong the whole time. That's what I mean by objective. Let me get some other questions in here.
It's good to say one thing is to look at morality as an emergent quality that comes about based on our circumstances. So if you're a hunter and gatherer, your view of the world is totally different, and we could look at a society like that and say they're immoral, but they're actually living closer to nature, while we are this huge society that is actually, we perceive ourselves as becoming more moral, we're actually destroying nature. So, who's moral?
Yeah, and I mean, so let me add one thing on there, which is I think I want to make clear, right? Moral realism is very on board with context sensitivity, right? If I'm me living in this developed first world country, right, my moral obligations with regard to eating or not eating animals, for example, is maybe going to be different than someone who literally needs to eat animals to survive, right? I don't literally need to eat animals to survive, and that changes the objective fact of the matter about what I should do with regard, and if you don't like the animals, I understand there's a lot of barbecue around here, pick a different example, right? But the idea is, right, I can vary, like these moral truths, right, they get weighed differently in different circumstances, and different facts of different circumstances matter. There's very complicated context sensitivity that goes into our actual moral decision making. I just think that fundamentally what we're doing when we do that is we're not making up the truth. We are trying to find this really, really complex truth. Yeah.
So one thing I would throw in around this whole issue about subjectivity and objectivity is that when we argue is morality or is ethics subjective or is it objective, we begin with the assumption that subjectivity and objectivity are distinct from one another, rather than conventions that we use, categories we use that are useful for some things, but are by no means necessarily true. You talked about the is-ought divide earlier, and you said, well, I'm cool with Hume and I'm cool with ought things and not making category errors, but I question whether the is-ought divide and the subject-object divide is a useful set of distinctions for even discussing this.
Good. Yes. So there are a lot of folks, especially amongst the virtue theorists, who think that the is-ought divide breaks down in certain situations. That there are certain claims that are both fundamentally is claims and fundamentally ought claims.
Right.
So the easy example would be things like having a broken arm, right? A statement of having a broken arm is not just an is statement, it's an evaluative judgment. It's saying there's not just something different, there's something wrong, right? So those kind of thick evaluative terms, these folks will argue, can provide a foundation on which to make thick evaluative ethical judgments as well. So I do agree that, like, now I being hammered into the analytic tradition, right, do think that it's valuable to talk about the difference between objective and subjective, right? I think it's a subjective moral truth whether you should grow your beard out. If you think you should grow your beard out, then you ought to grow your beard out. If you think your religion requires you to grow your beard out, then you ought to grow your beard out for your religion, as long as it's not causing too much suffering or violating any of the other norms, right? There's no objective fact of the matter about what is the right facial hair for men, right? What it is an objective fact is you shouldn't forcibly shave someone's beard because you don't like their religion, right? So does that make a bit of a fair distinction? That's why I think it is somewhat, but you're right, I think that, like, on some fundamental readings of the universe, right, this idea of objectivity and subjectivity become very, very fuzzy.
Because they take us right to that split line that says this is made of bits and pieces of things that have no valence, no
Right.
value, no values.
Right.
And then over here are our values, which are subjective and therefore somehow less real. But in fact, we know that I believe that we know that that's an artificial distinction.
Yeah.
In fact, the fabric of reality has both what we can observe, quote, objectively, but also is shot through with value.
Okay, good, right. So coming back to our friend Hume, right? Hume may, I think, go too far in the idea of thinking that reality is value neutral out there in the world, comes into our senses, and then we ascribe value onto it based on our value judgments, right? Where the reality is, before any sensation even hits you, it's already been loaded up with evaluative claims as well as empirical is claims, right? So in our experience, these things do come together fundamentally connected. Now, some philosophers will say, right, well, part of that is coming from the mind and the other part from the external world, and I don't want to dive too deep down this panpsychism rabbit holes. There's lots of interesting rabbit holes around these kinds of questions, whatever the metaphysics is, I just want to stick to this very basic claim that these moral truths are true independent of our beliefs about them. No amount of believing them to be otherwise will change them. That's all that matters to me. How it cashes out in terms of the nature of the universe is an interesting question, but ultimately secondary to that very important truth. Yeah.
So if morality is objectively real, what intellectual tool do we use to measure whether an individual moral claim is correct or not?
So that's where I think we have to employ empathy and reason and these various faculties of our. I don't think there's some people will say there's a moral intuition and you directly intuit the moral truth of the thing. I think it's a little more complicated, a little more nuanced than that.
But it seems like any two individuals might have different intuitions or impressions, and that seems to break down into subjectivity.
Well, so again, the argument from disagreement, I totally agree. People will have differing moral intuitions. I wouldn't be a pluralist if I didn't think that, right? There'd be no reason to be a pluralist if I thought everyone was going to have the same moral intuitions at the end of the day. I just don't think that it's a bad thing that people have. I think that it can be objective in the sense of, right? So let me do a little Aristotle here real fast, right? So Aristotle makes a distinction between subjective and relative to various individuals, right? He talks about Milo the wrestler, right? So Milo the wrestler, big dude, needs to eat a lot not to starve, right? I don't need to eat as much as Milo the wrestler, right? So it's relative to each of our body types how much we actually need to eat, but it's not subjective. I can't will myself to be able to eat as much as Milo and not gain a bunch of weight, right? So again, that's that same context sensitivity sort of thing. I think that different people in different contexts are right in coming to differing moral intuitions. And I think it's valuable for us to live in a world where people disagree with us morally, and we can see if there's a synthesis between those positions that will be even better than each of the separate positions.
But I think the counterexample would be if I put a rubber ball in a jar and had everyone come up and look at it and asked everyone, what color is that ball? And everyone told me a different color. It seems like that ball wouldn't have an objective color at that point.
Yes, I agree. And that's, I think, a way in which moral claims differ than physical claims. That being said, I would push back a little bit on the idea that you would ever have a situation where you put a moral problem in a jar and everyone came up and gave you a different answer. I think the vast majority of individuals, and not just because we've been habituated to believe the same things, but because as reasonable individuals, we can be reasoned towards similar, plausible, ethical conclusions. I think they're...
trolley problems.
Yeah, people do answer this.
Okay, so before we go to the trolley problem,
I have charts.
like I said, as a New Yorker, I can tell you it's an objective truth that while cold pizza is good, hot pizza is better, and the pizza is here. So I'm going to ask Aaron if he has any final words to wrap up, and say those of you who ordered pizza can get pizza, and those of you who didn't can still pepper Aaron with questions on a small group attack of him one time.
I can take you all. I'm not worried.
So any closing words from the void?
Thank you all very much. This has been wonderful. I'm glad that you all are thinking about this kind of stuff so thoroughly, and I am always happy to talk about it more. So thank you.